What happens when an artist doesn't just represent the natural world, but makes it anew through a creative lens? 5 alumni artists work with animals, plants, and environments, crafting them into personal expression and commenting on the human impulse to alter the world around us. The exhibition, curated by Lesley Wright, director of the museum, includes paintings, printmaking, sculpture, and drawings by artist Fay Stanford, Pamela Crockett, Aaron Rothman, Regan Golden, and John Martin Bell.
Greetings, I'm Pamela Crockett, sheltering in place from my home in Baltimore, Maryland. Well, this conversation was meant to be initiated by questions and responses from the Grinnell students, and I regret that I can't be with you in the museum. Nonetheless, I'm thrilled to be in the exhibition. So thank you, Lesley Wright, director of the museum, for inviting me, and thanks to Tilly Woodward for asking me to do a virtual tour. Let's start with the piece called Visible Strings. The paintings I have in this exhibit spring from a series called Dance of Decay, in which I explore the patterns of the natural world. I noticed on the museum's website it describes the human impulse to alter the world around us. Well, I don't think I'm trying to alter the world so much as I'm trying to observe it. Most of the images in my series began as drawings made from bits of decaying matter like seeds, nuts, pods, aquatic remnants. I collected them, brought them back to the studio, and studied them under the magnifying glass. All of the pieces in this exhibit are oil paintings. They're on either linen or canvas. What's missing from these digital representations is a sense of scale and a sense of texture. For example, the inspiration for this particular image was a decayed magnolia pod, maybe 1-2 inches long. Here the scale is enlarged to 61 inches, which is the size of most of my paintings in the series. And coincidentally, it's the size of me. I should mention here that I love to dance, all kinds of dance. So if you notice rhythms, motion, syncopation, and animation in the images, that is no coincidence. Recursive. Being curious about geometry in nature, I take note of growth patterns. I see radial, meandering, rhizome growth, branching, or in this case, a Romanesco cauliflower that I picked up at the farmer's market. It had this beautiful fractal-like recurring spiral. I'm not the first to see mathematical beauty in a spiral. In ancient times, it was described by Archimedes and then later by Descartes. And certainly I think about Fibonacci and his sequence of numbers. The geometry was revealed to me in rhythms on a shifting scale here, both macro and micro at the same time. I would classify this image as midway between order and chaos. Next, I want to look at an image called Twisting Bulb. A friend of mine bought this bulb in Amsterdam. It had bloomed and decayed, and by the time I saw it sitting on her coffee table, it was brown and it was quite dead. But somehow in it I saw this ephemeral beauty. The motion I noted of its twisting, curling leaves seemed to describe the story of its graceful demise. Notice how I use the frame within a frame. I do that a lot. It helps me when I contain the image and then simultaneously let it break out of its boundaries. You'll see an intentional shifting of foreground and background, and I mean to reflect an ambiguous space. I tried to create a depth of field by blurring the motion of the leaves in front, and the prismatic effect of light is meant to change from differing viewpoints, and that evokes a sense of the dead matter's dynamic animation. The next image is Anchovy Dance. These dried anchovies came from a Korean food market. A lot of people like to eat the dried fish. Personally, I don't, but I do enjoy observing them. There's this complex texture of scales and bones and dried guts that compels me to take a closer look. This might be a good time to talk about how I engage the viewer with color. I use layers of translucent oil paints. I love Indian yellow, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, Payne's gray, all the phthalo blues and greens. So I was smitten by the iridescent colors reflected off the backs of the anchovies. So I put them together for a whimsical partnered dance. Their shimmering sides put me in mind of the sequined characters strutting through a disco party, kinda Saturday Night Fever style, even though they don't look too happy about it. It's observation of inanimate objects like these dried fish that offered me the challenge to imbue them with movement and with activity. Next, I want to look at unraveling sea oat. I showed this image to a friend of mine the other day, and she described it as more dance-like than the previous one we just saw. She said the twisting, flinging shapes flying all over the page looked like a dance, and she said it looked like somebody just released their hair from a ponytail holder. Okay, I see what she means. After all, my works are quite gestural, but that is not how this painting started. Inspiration came from a small dead root of the sea oat. That's the tall grassy plants that grow on sand dunes. I found this one on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The plant is highly adaptable to harsh environments, and it has this flexibility, so in high winds it's not going to break, it just bends. The deep roots go sometimes 8 feet down, so it captures the sand and helps reduce erosion. The unraveling pattern of this one tiny root reminded me of the delicate balance in our endangered surroundings. But in truth, although I used close-up observation of this 2-inch brown root, I felt compelled to amplify the scale and the colors, to pump up the saturation, and to intensify the contrast. It happened to such an extent that it became something altogether different. People tell me they see ocean creatures in this painting. I guess I do too. Yeah, maybe I do alter nature just a tiny bit. I was asked to explain how my work might help others to consider our relationship to the natural world. In my series called Dance of Decay, I pose my fears and my hopes as I watch our planet changing way too fast. And since it's April of 2020, it would be hard to ignore the pandemic that we are all experiencing. The gallery director, the curator, all the artists in this exhibit, and I speak from a unique place in American history. Oh, actually in world history. I suppose you could say that this virus is nature-made, like the title of this exhibit. It is nature-made, but it's also made possible by human interference. As I speak, our works are resting in an empty, closed gallery in a college with no students, and it's giving us all an opportunity to rethink what is most precious, what is most important. But I find in a human crisis, the patterns of nature keep revealing themselves. Next, I want to look at regeneration. This is a close-up of a rhododendron bush, and this image gives me a bit of hope. I think about a vibrant ecosystem, and in it I see the process of decay as a cyclical dance. The various agents all have their parts to play, and the ordering of the steps is important. The rotting vegetation, sun, rain, wind, even the insects. They all have assigned roles, and they are inscribed into the choreography. I find it hopeful, though, because even as I look at the rhododendron's drooping blooms, and to me they look very flesh-like, even as I see them about to fall to the ground, the smallest seed still peeks out, hinting at potential for new growth. For the last image, I would like to circle back to the first one I showed you, visible strings. As I told you, I found this small, unrecognizable bit of decaying matter and started to paint it. The intertwined flowing white lines in and around the form suggested to me that it might be skeletal remains, but going back to the source a year later, I picked up a new, greener one, and then I recognized it was a magnolia pod. So I brought it back to my studio for observation, And in the days that followed, little sections of the new pod opened up and expelled red seeds. I was so surprised. I had no idea that magnolia pods did that. I love being surprised by nature. So these seeds were loosely attached by white gossamer threads, sort of like spiderweb strands. And that's when I realized my mistake. The white lines on the first decayed object were not skeletal, but they were the dried up strings from the previous year. So I'm working in reverse chronology, and this painting is showing various points in the passage of time. Here I should mention how I use texture, both in surface relief and by illusions. Sometimes I use the actual seeds, the nuts, or the pods dipped in oil paint for my mark making. But I might grab anything in my studio. Cheesecloth, netting, foam, you name it. In the borders you can see a pattern I made by dipping bubble wrap in paint and using it like a stamp. Also notice on the lower right corner where I dipped yarn in oil paint and laid it on the surface. I wanted to emphasize how the strings of the magnolia displayed a combination of tensile strength and flexibility, which provided the perfect balance for completing their mission to hold on to the seeds, but not too tightly. So here I've come to the end of the tour. I invite you to contact me if you want to further the discussion. I would love to hear your responses and your questions. You can visit my website. It has my email on it, and that would be my first and last name. It's PamelaCrockett.com. Thank you so much for listening. Stay safe.